August 1945. The Pacific sky hung heavy with gray mist as a convoy of American trucks crawled up a muddy road in the Philippines. Inside, a group of captured Japanese women sat in silence, their faces pale, eyes fixed on the floorboards. The war had ended, but the air still smelled of it: oil, sweat, and burnt soil. Some wore torn military nursing uniforms, others threadbare civilian clothes. None spoke. They had been told stories, that the Americans were brutal, that captivity was worse than death, that dishonor was the final punishment of defeat. When the gates of the American internment camp opened, they braced themselves. Soldiers with rifles stood watch, their faces unreadable beneath helmets and dust. But then came something unexpected. Blankets, canteens of water, quiet instructions in slow, careful English. One woman stared in disbelief as an American officer bowed slightly before leading them to the barracks. Another blinked as a medic offered her food, not scraps but full rations. In that instant, confusion spread among the women like a quiet tremor. This was not what they had been taught to expect. For the first time since surrender, fear began to mix with something unfamiliar, a cautious sense of dignity. When Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945, a shock wave spread across the Pacific and through the Japanese homeland itself. For years, the imperial government had indoctrinated its citizens with the belief that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, worse than death. Women in particular had been raised under the strict codes of Bushido and the concept of Onna Daigaku, the great learning for women which taught loyalty, obedience, and self-sacrifice for family and emperor. They were expected to endure, to serve, and if necessary, to die rather than live in shame. Yet as Japan fell, many of these women, nurses, clerks, communication aides, and civilian volunteers attached to military units, found themselves prisoners in American custody, alive but burdened by the unbearable weight of survival. By the final months of 1945, thousands of Japanese soldiers and support personnel had surrendered across the Pacific. In the Philippines, Guam, Okinawa, and scattered island garrisons once thought impenetrable. Among them were women who had served in military hospitals, field kitchens, or administrative offices. Their capture was unthinkable to the Japanese military hierarchy, which had long maintained that women were never to be taken alive. In propaganda distributed to both soldiers and civilians, American forces were depicted as monsters, barbaric invaders who would defile any Japanese woman they found. These stories ensured resistance to the last breath, but they also meant that when capture finally came, it carried unimaginable psychological terror. The Pacific War had been a brutal contest marked by mutual dehumanization. From Bataan to Guadalcanal, both sides had committed acts that left deep scars. Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners, forced marches, starvation, and executions, was known to American troops, fueling a hatred that seemed impossible to dissolve. Many expected retribution once the tables turned. And yet, by the time the United States began handling large numbers of Japanese POWs, a different philosophy had begun to shape American policy. The idea was not simply to defeat Japan militarily, but to break the ideological roots that had sustained its aggression. General Douglas MacArthur, overseeing the Allied occupation, understood that lasting peace would come not through vengeance but through transformation, social, political, and moral. In the Pacific theater, this transformation began in the unlikeliest places: the prisoner of war and civilian internment camps. Far from the scenes of combat, these camps became laboratories for post-war re-education, humanitarian practice, and reconciliation. Under the Geneva Conventions, the United States had an obligation to treat prisoners humanely. But for many officers, it was more than a legal duty. It was a strategic act. The way Americans treated their captives would define the post-war narrative, shaping how the defeated nation would perceive its conquerors. At the same time, most Japanese women entering these camps carried internalized fear and shame. Their worldview had been shattered. They had been told that Americans were ruthless, that capture meant torture or worse. Many expected to be stripped, humiliated, or enslaved. Some even begged their guards to execute them rather than bring them into the camp. Yet, when they were instead handed blankets and soap, when medics tended to their wounds without mockery, when soldiers spoke to them with basic courtesy, their psychological foundation began to crumble. For the first time, they confronted a contradiction too large to reconcile. The supposed enemy was showing them humanity. Inside the camps, cultural differences created constant tension. Japanese women bowed deeply when spoken to, avoided direct eye contact, and hesitated to touch food before permission was given. American guards, unaccustomed to such formality, often misread their silence as hostility. And yet, day by day, small adjustments began to form an unlikely rhythm. Meals were distributed at set times, rice where possible but often replaced by bread and canned meat. Some of the women tried to hide food out of instinct, expecting it to be taken away later. Others ate in haste, fearful that generosity was a temporary illusion. But when the next meal came and the next after that, trust, hesitant, fragile trust, began to replace terror. The role of American female personnel in these camps was particularly significant. Nurses, clerks, and Red Cross workers embodied a cultural contrast that struck the Japanese women deeply. In Imperial Japan, women rarely held visible authority within military or public structures. Yet here were American women wearing uniforms, issuing instructions, and working side by side with men as equals. To many of the Japanese captives, it was an inversion of the social order they had been raised to obey. Some whispered among themselves that this equality was improper, even shameful. Others quietly and often guiltily admired it. Reports from camps in the Philippines, Guam, and Okinawa noted these early encounters with astonishment. An American sergeant stationed in Leyte wrote in a 1946 field note that the Japanese women seem most shocked not by captivity, but by how they are treated. They bow repeatedly, perhaps waiting for cruelty, but when none comes, they appear confused, even distressed. The psychological strain of kindness, after years of conditioning to expect brutality, was profound. Many of the prisoners began to write about it in secret, small, fragile notes hidden in blankets or tucked inside ration tins. For the first time, their words were free from censorship and fear. The camp routines followed a strict structure: early roll calls, hygiene inspections, and work assignments. Yet unlike the Japanese military's rigid hierarchies, these orders were not barked but explained. American officers believed that discipline without humiliation was more effective, a lesson learned from earlier conflicts. Translators, many of them Japanese Americans from the Military Intelligence Service, played a crucial role. They bridged not only the language gap but also the emotional one. Some of them, Nisei, born in California or Hawaii, spoke to the prisoners gently, using phrases that felt familiar and foreign at once. Their presence often startled the captives. To hear a Japanese voice speaking in defense of American fairness was something beyond comprehension. Outside the camp's perimeter, the Pacific world was transforming. Cities across Japan lay in ruins, Hiroshima and Nagasaki reduced to silent wastelands. Food shortages persisted, disease spread, and millions of displaced civilians wandered through the wreckage of empire. In this chaos, the treatment of prisoners became a symbolic gesture of what the new order would look like. American authorities allowed visits from the Red Cross, maintained medical facilities, and kept detailed records of rations and living conditions. Even though resources were limited, the emphasis on humane treatment was deliberate. Each act of compassion was meant to contrast with the cruelty of Japan's wartime regime, sending a message that democracy was not merely a political system, it was a moral code. For the Japanese women, these messages began to sink in slowly, almost painfully. Acts of equality, being spoken to directly, being asked opinions, being invited to assist in medical tasks, challenged everything they believed about hierarchy and gender. One nurse later recalled how stunned she was when an American medic asked her to help sterilize surgical tools, as if she were a colleague rather than a prisoner. In that moment, she wrote, I felt seen as a person, not an enemy. I did not know what to do with that feeling. Yet not all found peace in this reversal. Some remained defiant, unwilling to accept generosity from those they still considered invaders. They stood apart, performing their duties with mechanical precision, refusing to make eye contact or speak. Others struggled with guilt for surviving, for feeling gratitude, for beginning to question their own nation's ideals. The internal conflict was immense, but within that turmoil lay the seed of something deeper: awareness. This awareness, fragile but growing, marked the beginning of a profound transformation not just for these women, but for Japan itself. It showed how ideas could crumble not only through war, but through unexpected kindness. And it was inside these quiet camps, among barbed wire and ration tins, that the real test began, not of military strength but of humanity itself. The first weeks inside the camp were defined by silence. Rows of barracks lined with cots and straw mattresses sat under a sky that always seemed gray, as if reluctant to clear the memory of the war. The Japanese women moved quietly through the compound, eyes lowered, their movements careful and restrained. The Americans observed them with curiosity but also with a measure of respect. Orders had been given from the top. No mistreatment, no humiliation. "They are prisoners, not animals," one commanding officer reminded his men. For the women, that simple rule defied every expectation. Gradually, routines formed a strange normalcy. The morning began with roll call, then breakfast, powdered eggs, bread, and weak coffee, a taste both alien and unsettling to women used to rice and miso soup. Yet despite the strangeness, the food came every day. Hunger was a constant companion during the war, but here meals were regular. Some prisoners hid bread beneath their clothes at first, afraid that the kindness might end. Others watched in disbelief when American guards distributed extra rations to the sick or pregnant. To them, this was inconceivable. Soon the camp's medical facilities became a quiet center of transformation. American doctors, faced with malnourished and feverish prisoners, began calling for volunteers to assist in care. When the first few Japanese nurses stepped forward, there was tension, uncertainty on both sides. But something remarkable happened. As they worked side by side, hands passing scalpels, gauze, and syringes, a fragile trust began to take shape. The Americans were surprised by the women's discipline and skill. The Japanese nurses, in turn, were startled by how the doctors spoke to them, not barking orders but explaining, even thanking them. It was a tone of equality that few had ever experienced. Outside the infirmary, the camp's educational programs were taking shape. The American administration believed that teaching English, hygiene, and civics could help reshape Japanese thought in the post-war era. To the captives, it felt both intrusive and enlightening. Some resisted, refusing to attend classes. Others, curious despite themselves, listened as translators explained unfamiliar words like democracy and rights. The concepts sounded alien, almost naive, yet they planted quiet questions in the minds of women who had been taught to obey without hesitation. Perhaps the most striking encounters occurred during camp labor. Each day, groups were assigned to laundry, gardening, and kitchen duties. One morning, a squad of Japanese women arrived to scrub floors, expecting to be supervised harshly. Instead, they found American WWII, Women's Army Corps members, working beside them. These women, dressed in pressed uniforms and laughing among themselves, carried authority without arrogance. For the Japanese prisoners, it was an image that upended everything they believed about gender. Women giving orders, women working freely among men, women who looked confident, unashamed, and respected. Some of the Japanese nurses whispered that it was improper. Others, especially the younger ones, felt something else entirely: admiration. There were moments of tension, of course. Cultural friction surfaced in gestures and misunderstandings. When an American sergeant corrected a prisoner for bowing too deeply, she burst into tears, believing she had been insulted. Another time, an American woman offered a handshake, only to be met with paralyzed confusion. The gesture seen as forward, even intimate. But over time, laughter began to break through the discomfort. Gestures became softer, eyes less guarded. Humanity was replacing ideology, one small moment at a time. In letters and diaries later found after the war, some of the women described these early days with disbelief. One nurse wrote, "We expected hatred. Instead, we were given soap and smiles. It was unbearable. I did not know if it was mercy or mockery." For many, the kindness felt like an emotional ambush. They had been raised to expect cruelty from conquerors, not compassion. To be treated as equals, even for a moment, was disorienting. It challenged everything they had been taught about loyalty, honor, and identity. American officers, meanwhile, were quietly aware of the psychological importance of this treatment. They knew that every interaction inside the camp would ripple outward, shaping how these women would speak of America once repatriated. Reports sent to the War Department described the experiment, inhumane conduct, as a form of psychological disarmament. It wasn't about softening hearts for sympathy, but proving a point that democratic ideals could achieve what bombs could not. At night, the camp settled into uneasy quiet. The sound of distant waves mixed with the murmurs of conversation. Some prisoners prayed. Others lay awake, staring at the tin ceilings, their minds circling the same unanswerable question. How could enemies act with decency? Slowly, the camp's barbed wire began to feel less like a cage and more like a fragile boundary between two worlds. The past they came from, and the strange new one forming before their eyes. Months passed. The American guards rotated out, new ones came in, but the rhythm of the camp stayed steady. What changed was the tone. Less fear, more cooperation. American nurses taught first aid to their Japanese counterparts. The women, in return, demonstrated techniques they had used in field hospitals under bombardment. Mutual respect began to replace suspicion. One memorable day during a Red Cross inspection, several Japanese prisoners were asked to assist in distributing supplies to their fellow captives. The Americans did not supervise closely. They trusted them to act responsibly. That small gesture of autonomy, the freedom to help others, moved many of the women to tears. For the first time, they were given authority not through power but through trust. Yet the transformation was not merely emotional, it was moral and cultural. The prisoners began to compare the conduct of their captors to the discipline of their former officers. In the Imperial Japanese Army, subordinates were beaten for mistakes. Here, American soldiers corrected with words. Where failure once meant disgrace, now it was met with instruction. Slowly, the women began to sense a pattern. That strength need not be cruelty, that authority could coexist with compassion. Some Americans, too, were changed by what they witnessed. One corporal wrote in a letter home that he had never imagined seeing a Japanese nurse crying because someone said thank you to her. He described it as a strange moment of realization that the enemy, stripped of propaganda and uniform, looked more human than monstrous. The hatred bred by years of war began to dissolve into reluctant empathy. Among the Japanese captives, one woman named Sato became symbolic of this transformation. Once a stern hospital matron, she had been feared by her subordinates for her discipline. In the camp, she remained withdrawn until an American nurse, Lieutenant Miller, invited her to assist in dressing wounds. Over weeks of shared labor, their silence gave way to small exchanges, gestures, then words. When Sato was later released, she wrote in her post-war memoir that the Americans conquered not only our army but our pride. Yet in their mercy, they gave us back our humanity. By late 1946, many camps began preparations for repatriation. The war was long over and reconstruction had begun in Japan. The departing women carried with them not souvenirs, but experiences that would challenge post-war Japan's moral landscape. They had seen the face of equality, and it had not come from their homeland but from their conquerors. Still, the process was not without pain. Many felt deep shame for accepting kindness from those they once fought. Others feared being ostracized upon return. But beneath that fear was a quiet conviction that something essential had changed, a realization that power did not have to humiliate, and victory did not have to destroy. Inside the camp's boundaries, where barbed wire once symbolized division, a fragile sense of reconciliation had taken root. For the Japanese women who had entered those gates expecting degradation, it was the most unexpected lesson of all, that dignity could survive defeat and that respect, even from an enemy, could heal wounds deeper than any battlefield scar. The moment would soon lead to a profound transformation, a decisive event that crystallized this fragile trust into undeniable truth. The turning point came in early 1946, when the camp was visited by a group of high-ranking American officers and Red Cross delegates. It was meant to be a routine inspection, a formal evaluation of living standards, hygiene, and prisoner welfare. But for the Japanese women held within those fences, it would become something far more profound. For months they had adjusted to the rhythm of captivity, roll calls, rations, and the strange civility of their guards. Yet beneath that fragile calm there lingered a quiet disbelief, a suspicion that all this kindness was temporary, a mask that would fall away once no one was watching. That morning the camp was unusually quiet. The prisoners, dressed in their plain khaki uniforms, lined up in orderly rows near the courtyard. American officers arrived in jeeps, stepping out with clipboards and cameras. The women bowed deeply, their eyes fixed on the dirt, expecting to be inspected like livestock. Instead, the senior American officer, a colonel in his 40s, removed his cap and greeted them with a nod. Through the interpreter, he announced that the inspection would not only assess the camp's conditions but would also involve interviews with the prisoners themselves. "You will speak freely," the interpreter translated, "and your words will be recorded. No punishment will follow honesty." The silence that followed was thick with unease. The idea that they could speak freely to authority was foreign, almost absurd. In the Japanese military culture they had served, words were weapons that could destroy lives. Honesty, especially from a woman, had never been safe. Yet here these captors were asking for it, even encouraging it. The women exchanged uncertain glances. Slowly, a few stepped forward. The interviews began under the afternoon sun held beneath a canvas tent. American officers sat at folding tables while translators and stenographers took notes. One by one, the women were invited to sit and speak. At first, their words came haltingly, rehearsed answers, cautious pleasantries. But when one young nurse, barely 20, began to cry as she described the final days of her hospital unit in the Philippines, something shifted. The Americans listened in silence, not interrupting, not judging. She spoke of bombing raids, of wounded soldiers begging for water, of being told by her superiors to take poison rather than surrender. "I wanted to live," she said softly, "but living was a sin." Her words rippled through the camp. Others began to open up, not only about their suffering but about their confusion. One woman admitted she had expected to be assaulted. Another said she still didn't understand why the Americans treated them with dignity. "It makes no sense," she said through tears, "because we were taught you had none." The interpreters hesitated as they translated, unsure whether such confessions were too raw. But the colonel nodded for them to continue. For the American officers, these testimonies were deeply revealing. They showed how deeply Japan's wartime propaganda had dehumanized its enemies, and how the seeds of hatred had been sown in fear, not truth. For the prisoners, the act of speaking, of being heard without consequence, was transformative. Many wept after the interviews, overwhelmed not by shame, but by a strange, cleansing relief. That evening, something unexpected happened. After the inspection ended, the colonel instructed that the camp gates between the inner compound and the recreation yard be opened. He announced that the women could move freely within the camp boundaries until further notice. There would be no armed escorts, no shouted commands. The guards would remain at their posts, but their rifles would stay lowered. At first, no one moved. The women stood frozen, staring at the open gates. The sky was beginning to turn gold, the sound of cicadas carrying faintly across the perimeter. Then one of the younger women, perhaps emboldened by the day's events, took a tentative step forward. No one stopped her. She crossed the threshold and walked slowly toward the edge of the yard. A few others followed, their movements hesitant, disbelieving. Within minutes, the camp that had once moved in strict lines dissolved into small groups wandering through open space. The guards watched quietly. Some smiled faintly. Others simply looked away, unwilling to intrude on what was unfolding. For the prisoners, the sensation of walking freely, without command, without fear, was indescribable. A few bent to touch the earth as if confirming it was real. One woman picked a small wildflower that had pushed through the gravel and held it between her fingers, trembling. In that quiet act, surrounded by the remnants of war, she realized something extraordinary. The enemy had given her back her freedom before her own nation ever would. Word of the change spread quickly through the camp. That night, conversations rippled through the barracks. The women spoke not only of the day's events but of what they meant. "Why would they do this?" one asked. "They have nothing to gain." Another whispered, "Maybe they see us as people, not as enemies." For the first time, hope entered the vocabulary of captivity. It was not the naive hope of release or return, but something subtler, the hope that dignity could survive even in defeat. In the days that followed, the camp took on a new rhythm. Without constant supervision, the women began to organize themselves. They cleaned the barracks, tended small gardens, and even started teaching one another. English lessons, sewing, basic arithmetic. The Americans provided notebooks and pencils. Some of the guards, seeing the effort, joined in informal exchanges of words and songs. In one corner, a wax sergeant taught a group of nurses to write their names in English. In another, Japanese women shared traditional songs that drifted softly through the night air. The transformation did not go unnoticed. Visiting Red Cross officials documented the camp as a model of humane discipline, noting that trust had replaced coercion. But beyond the reports and photographs, something intangible had occurred. The women who had entered the camp terrified and broken now carried themselves differently, shoulders straighter, eyes lifted, steps more assured. They were still prisoners, but the psychological bars had begun to fade. One morning, weeks later, a symbolic gesture sealed the change. The American commander ordered that the barbed wire separating the women's compound from the medical facilities be removed. It was a practical decision, to allow easier movement for labor and assistance. But to the prisoners, it was something far greater. As the last coils of wire were pulled down, the women stood watching in silence. The sun glinted off the metal, and for a moment the scene felt almost ceremonial. Some of them wept quietly, not out of sadness, but from the sheer strangeness of it, that mercy could feel heavier than punishment. That same day, a group of American and Japanese nurses worked together to treat a local Filipino child suffering from malnutrition. It was the first time since the war's end that both sides had cooperated for a single human purpose. The women washed the child's wounds, shared what little medicine they had, and when he smiled faintly in recovery, a collective silence fell over the room. In that moment, the weight of everything, or propaganda, hatred, ideology, seemed to melt away. They were no longer conquerors and conquered, just people trying to heal the damage left by others. In reports sent back to Washington, officers described these moments as psychological victories. But for the women who lived them, they were not politics, they were revelations. The enemy they had been taught to hate had treated them not as subjects but as equals. The lessons of power and obedience that had shaped their lives crumbled before something far simpler and more enduring: respect. And yet, the deeper impact of this moment would only unfold after the war, when these women returned home and carried their memories back to a nation struggling to redefine itself. The seeds planted within those fences, and of equality, trust, and shared humanity, would take root in unexpected ways. But before that transformation could begin, one final chapter in their captivity remained: the aftermath, when freedom itself would test what they had learned inside the walls of their confinement. When the repatriation orders finally arrived, the announcement spread through the camp with a strange mix of relief and apprehension. The war had ended more than a year ago, yet for many of the women, time inside the American compound had existed in a separate rhythm, slower, quieter, and more humane than the world they had left behind. They were going home, but home was no longer what it once was. The Japan they would return to was a nation in ruins, its cities burned to ash, its emperor now a symbolic figure stripped of divinity. What awaited them was uncertain. What they carried back, however, was something the war had not destroyed: the memory of being treated as human beings by those they once called enemies. The final weeks before departure were filled with administrative routines, medical checks, debriefings, and the issuing of identification tags. Each woman was photographed, her record carefully logged. American officers oversaw the process with the same respect that had defined the camp since its reformation. But beneath the orderliness, emotion stirred. Many of the women found themselves strangely reluctant to leave. Some wept quietly when saying goodbye to the American nurses and guards who had become part of their daily lives. Others bowed deeply, unsure of how to express gratitude in words that transcended language. When the first group boarded the transport trucks bound for the harbor, the air was heavy with silence. The vehicles rumbled past the camp gates that had once defined their captivity, but now seemed to hold their safety. Some of the guards saluted as the trucks passed. Others simply raised their hands in farewell. Inside the trucks, the women clutched small bundles of belongings: letters, photographs, notebooks, and in some cases, the simple bar of soap or towel that had been given to them months before. To anyone else, these were trivial objects. To them, they were proof that compassion could survive even in war. The journey home took weeks. Many traveled aboard former American transport ships now repurposed for repatriation. The ocean, calm and endless, mirrored their conflicted hearts. Some women stood on deck watching the horizon, wondering what kind of reception awaited them. They feared being labeled as tainted, as collaborators, or as women who had lost their honor by surrendering. In Japanese culture at the time, capture was not an act of survival. It was a permanent stain. But still, they carried with them the quiet dignity that had been restored by their American captors. When the ships finally docked in ports like Yokohama and Maizuru, they were met by a landscape that felt almost unrecognizable. The air was thick with coal dust and the smell of destruction. Bombed-out buildings stood like skeletons against the gray winter sky. The once bustling streets were filled with orphans, widows, and the unemployed. Even the language of daily life had changed. New words like democracy and freedom and reform had entered Japan's vocabulary, reshaping the moral framework of a broken empire. The women stepped onto the docks with small bundles and heavy hearts, uncertain where they fit in this new order. The process of reintegration was harsh. Many of the returning prisoners faced suspicion and silence. Families often avoided questions about captivity, seeing it as a source of shame. Some of the women found that their husbands or brothers had died in combat. Others discovered that their homes were gone, replaced by charred ruins or American military installations. Yet even in their grief, they carried a calmness that others noticed but could not explain. A nurse from Hiroshima later wrote in her memoir, "We had been defeated twice, once by war and once by kindness. The second defeat taught us how to live again." A few of the former POWs were called upon by the newly established Japanese government and the Allied occupation authorities to share their experiences. Their testimonies became valuable sources for understanding the cultural transformation taking place across Japan. American officers, aware of the symbolic power of these women's stories, encouraged them to speak openly. Reports sent to Tokyo noted that these former prisoners spoke of discipline, fairness, and respect, describing how the Americans had treated them not as enemies, but as equals. To the Japanese public still struggling with bitterness and humiliation, such stories were difficult to accept. Yet they slowly began to circulate, becoming part of the moral rebuilding of a nation. For many of these women, the greatest transformation was internal. They had entered captivity believing that mercy was weakness, that surrender erased all worth. But the Americans' treatment had taught them something radical, that dignity could exist even in powerlessness. This realization changed how they viewed authority, hierarchy, and womanhood itself. Before the war, a woman's value in Japan was measured by her obedience to father, husband, or emperor. In the camps, they had seen women in uniform, American and confident, speaking freely beside men. That image stayed with them long after they returned home. Years later, as Japan began to rebuild under the guidance of the Allied occupation, these lessons would ripple quietly through society. Some of the former prisoners became teachers, nurses, or civil servants, applying the principles of equality and compassion they had witnessed firsthand. A few even worked with American humanitarian organizations during Japan's post-war reconstruction. Their experiences, though rarely spoken of publicly, had transformed their understanding of what it meant to be Japanese, to be women, and to be human. Yet not all memories were peaceful. Some women struggled with guilt, unable to reconcile gratitude toward their captors with loyalty to their fallen comrades. Others were haunted by nightmares of the war, bombing, starvation, and loss. The kindness they experienced in captivity had not erased those scars. It had only made them more complex. One former nurse wrote decades later, "They treated us with respect. It was unbearable at first because it made us see what we had become." As the years passed, the details of their captivity faded into history, overshadowed by larger political narratives. But within that silence, the memory of decency remained, fragile yet enduring. When some of these women were interviewed by historians in the 1970s and 1980s, their words carried the same astonishment they had felt in 1946. "They let us walk freely," one recalled. "They called us by name, not number. They said please and thank you. We did not understand it then, but it changed us." Historians later recognized that these acts of humanity were not isolated gestures, but part of a broader shift in American military conduct during the occupation. The United States had realized that moral authority could achieve what force alone could not. By treating prisoners with respect, they undermined the ideological foundation of militarism itself. For the Japanese women who lived through it, this became a lesson not only in politics but in morality, that compassion was a kind of power, one that survived the collapse of nations. Decades after the war, Reunions between former captors and captives occasionally took place. In 1985, a small gathering in Tokyo brought together American veterans and Japanese nurses who had once shared the same camp. Photographs from that event show handshakes, quiet tears, and hesitant smiles. Time had softened the memory of enmity, leaving behind only the shared weight of survival. One American veteran, when asked why he treated prisoners humanely, simply said, "Because we wanted the war to end with our humanity intact." For the women, that sentiment echoed their own unspoken truth. They had been taught that to lose was to lose everything, yet in defeat they had discovered something victory could not give: the understanding that respect, once given, can rebuild even the most broken soul. And as Japan rose from the ashes, transforming from empire to democracy, the quiet legacy of those women endured, invisible yet foundational. Their stories, whispered across generations, reminded a new Japan that compassion had once come from the unlikeliest place: the hands of the enemy. But the story did not end there. As time passed and the world changed, historians began to reflect on what these encounters truly meant, not just for the individuals involved, but for humanity itself. In the stillness of history, long after the echoes of gunfire have faded, what remains are the choices made when victory or vengeance were possible, and compassion was chosen instead. The story of those Japanese women, once prisoners of war and later silent witnesses to humanity's contradictions, stands as one of those rare moments when decency triumphed over destruction. Their experience was not merely an episode of mercy and captivity. It was a quiet revolution in the moral landscape of war. Within the barbed wire, where humiliation could have been justified and cruelty excused, the Americans chose restraint. They offered trust instead of fear, respect instead of superiority. For the women who had been raised in a culture of obedience and submission, this was more than kindness. It was a revelation. It showed that strength could exist without domination, that dignity could be restored without hierarchy. When these women returned home, the lessons they carried were invisible, but enduring. Some shared them with students, others with their children. A few never spoke of them again, afraid that no one would understand. Yet the legacy endured, not in the archives of military history, but in the quiet evolution of thought, in the way Japan began to redefine honor, equality, and humanity after its greatest defeat. Historians now view these encounters as an overlooked bridge between war and peace, the human connection that helped transform two bitter enemies into future allies. It was not born from treaties or politics, but from something simpler: the recognition of shared suffering, and the refusal to let hatred define what came after. The story of those women reminds us that war tests not only armies but also values. And sometimes in the ruins of empire and ideology, the smallest gestures, a handshake, a shared meal, an act of trust, become the foundation for peace. The Japanese prisoners could not believe they were treated as equals, but in that disbelief was the beginning of understanding that even in war's darkest aftermath, humanity still had the power to choose light.